To get a global perspective on how President Putin's war on Ukraine has gone so far and what could happen from here on, I'm joined live and exclusive at this time by Gideon Rachman. Gideon is the chief foreign affairs commentator of the Financial Times. He's the author of Zero-Sum Future: American Power in an Age of Anxiety, Easternization, War and Peace in the Asian Century, and is one of the foremost commentators on foreign affairs globally. Mr. Rachman, welcome, and it's great to have you with us once again on India Today.
Thanks.
I want to start by asking you whether it's a fair assessment to conclude that President Putin's war on Ukraine, 100 hours into this invasion, hasn't gone as he would have planned. I want to ask you why that's the case.
Well, we don't know what was in his head. He's never been frank about that. But I think it's fair to say that probably they were hoping for a swift victory. I mean, that Putin believed elements of his own propaganda, that this was a puppet government, that the Ukrainian people regarded the Russians as brothers and would welcome them. And obviously, they've been hit with extremely fierce resistance. Western intelligence hasn't always been faultless over the last 20 years, but they've been pretty good on this. They've been saying for 2 months that that there would be a full-scale invasion, that they would invade, they would go for Kiev, and that the Russian plan sort of foresaw Kiev falling in about 3 days. And as you say, we're now in day 5, and that hasn't happened. And they haven't even managed to take Kharkiv, which is 30 miles from the Russian border. So no, it's not going well. But that doesn't mean he'll give up, I'm afraid. In fact, I think in some ways it makes it more dangerous because he's not going to admit defeat. So I think escalation is his only route now.
In the midst of this invasion, President Putin has put his nuclear defense forces on a state of readiness. What, according to you, apart from the obvious, is the message that Putin is sending internally, externally to Ukraine and to the rest of the world?
Well, obviously, as you say, it's deterrence. It's saying to the West, back off, don't intervene, or, I could unleash a nuclear war. The question, obviously, is how seriously we should take those threats. And I think you need to take them fairly seriously. Russian military doctrine actually includes going nuclear quite quickly, including the use of tactical nuclear weapons, which are not, the ones you drop on foreign cities, but that you use on battlefields. And as I said, Putin is cornered now. Now, I would like to believe that he is not so crazy and so, reckless, evil, whatever word you want to choose, that he would actually use nuclear weapons for the first time, since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It would be an incredible departure for the whole world. But, there are dangers. Obviously, there's the danger he would do it deliberately. Also, that events get out of hand. The Americans will have to respond now. They may go on nuclear alert. You get into a very dangerous cycle of escalation. It's reminiscent of something like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
What's your assessment of President Putin's state of mind? Ever since the pandemic set in, he's been aloof, cut off from most of his closest associates, tending to be all by himself in his dacha. Is this man, according to you, in touch with reality, or has he built a delusional bubble about himself?
Well, it's looking increasingly like he isn't in touch with reality. In fact, I think that one of the reasons that many people didn't believe the increasingly dark intelligence predictions you were getting since December was people said, look, we know this guy. He's been around for 20 years. He's ruthless, but he's quite calculating. He doesn't do crazy things, and invading Ukraine would be crazy. But then a counter theory was that, as you suggest, he's changed. That 20 years in power have made him increasingly paranoid and megalomaniacal, and that the COVID outbreak has meant that, as you say, he's been very isolated, talking mainly to 2 or 3 advisors who seem to be extreme nationalists. And he's old now, he's 69. He may feel that, he's more than 20 years in power, that this is his last chance to secure his legacy. And he wants to secure a legacy as a sort of equivalent to a Peter the Great, a great Russian leader who, was ruthless, was willing to kill, but who reunited the country as he sees it. And that, I think, is what we're seeing happen now.
Given the ferocity of the Ukrainian pushback, given also the fact that the rest of the world, especially NATO countries, are sending military aid and weapon systems to Ukraine. Is it now almost inevitable that over the next few hours, the intensity of Russia's assault on Ukrainian cities is likely to go up dramatically?
I hesitate to say inevitable, partly because, in these kinds of situations, nothing is completely foretold. And also because we're all human and I don't want to believe that they're going to flatten Kiev. But again, the kind of security sources in the West who so far have got this conflict pretty right have been saying from the beginning that he will use very, very ruthless tactics, that he will do what he did in Chechnya, in Aleppo, in Syria, where they did flatten cities. They used the most intense weapons in urban areas. They killed a lot of civilians. And I think particularly because he hasn't won easily, assuming he's still committed to victory, then I think there is a big danger that they will escalate and that they will accept killing a lot of civilians in the search of victory.
What do you make of the global response to this Russian invasion of Ukraine? A lot of the inertia in Europe seems to have been shaken off. Germany vowing to rearm itself, Switzerland also condemning and acting against what Russia is doing. So we're seeing Europe galvanized in a way that it hasn't been of late.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I think that is a big part of Putin's miscalculation. I think that after Crimea, the West also made threats saying, we'll damage you economically, we'll destroy the Russian economy, and not that much happened. And I think Putin might have calculated, well, it'll be the same this time. They'll huff and puff, but not much will happen. But he was wrong, so that, within days, as you say, really quite historic shifts in German foreign policy. And Germany is obviously the most powerful nation in the European Union, but a country that, because of the Second World War, has a strong pacifist streak. But suddenly they are committing to, hugely increase defense spending, and almost as significant, they are sending weapons, anti-tank weapons and so on to Ukraine. Now, just last week, I was in Munich, where the German foreign minister had a conversation in public with the mayor of Kiev, Vasily Klitschko, the former world heavyweight boxing champion. And Klitschko stood up and said, we need defensive weapons. All you've sent us is 5,000 helmets. That's just not enough. And the German foreign minister, Baerbock, said, look, we sympathize, but because of our history, we can't do that kind of thing. We can't supply weapons into a conflict area. And in a week, that has completely turned on its head. So, yeah, it's a dramatic shift. And then, of course, there's the financial and economic sanctions. There were doubts. Would we really cut Russia out of the SWIFT banking system? Because that can have blowback on the West. Would we really freeze the assets of the Russian central bank? Because, financial systems, as you know, are delicate things. They're all connected. Suddenly people in the West may not be getting payments they would count on and so on. So again, there's a risk of blowback. But they've gone quite quickly for the toughest financial and economic sanctions. And you're seeing the impact on Russian streets immediately. I mean, the ruble has halved in value. The stock market has plummeted. People are queuing around the block in Moscow to try to withdraw their cash from the bank. So the effects have been very dramatic.
What impact will these economic sanctions have, according to you, on the rest of the world? Because global markets are spooked, industrialists very concerned, not just about the impact on the Russian economy, but the impact that this squeeze and sanctions has on the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a bit unpredictable, which is one of the reasons to be concerned, frankly. But I mean, there are some things that are clearly predictable. I think that Russia is the major energy supplier to a lot of Europe. Germany gets 40% of its gas, Italy 45% of its gas. Now, energy prices were already rising very sharply in Europe. I'm not sure what was happening in India before then, but I suspect globally they've been rising, and I think they will rise again. So this inflation that we were having will get worse. I think Russia's not a hugely significant economy, say like a China or even in India, but it's a significant market. So a lot of Western companies will take a hit. BP, British Petroleum, for example, has a $14 billion stake in a Russian oil firm, which it's having to sell and presumably won't get a great price at this point. And then there are the unforeseen things that, as I say, Russia is deeply integrated into the global financial system. And if you remember, go a long way back now, but there was a financial crisis in 1998. caused by the collapse of a hedge fund in America, and that was started in Russia. It was the default of a Russian payer. So it's not like this is completely irrelevant to Wall Street or London or to the Indian financial markets. There can be knock-on effects that are sort of hidden in the system that we haven't quite seen yet, but we may become aware of quite soon.
Does peace have a chance at all? Conversations going on between a delegation from Russia with a delegation from Ukraine in Belarus near the Ukrainian capital, near the Ukrainian border with Russia, with Belarus. Is there any possibility that there could be some breakthrough in the peace talks, according to you?
Look, there has to be a possibility. I don't think it's very promising because if you look at the people that Russia has sent, the leader of the Russian delegation is a very junior former official. We're not talking about Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. The guy they've sent is somebody they sacked from the government not so long ago who's known for extreme nationalist views. So it looks at the moment as if Putin is laying the ground to say, well, I tried, I spoke to them, but they remained unreasonable, and therefore I went for the attack. But one can't be sure that's the position. And, if you were being hopeful, you would say, well, Putin has seen things aren't going well, doesn't actually want to devastate a neighboring country. He will treat it differently from Syria. And that these talks could give him a way out. If the Ukrainians make some token concessions, maybe there's a way out. That wouldn't be my bet. I fear that we're going to hear quite soon they failed and the war continues. But look, in the long run, this war has to end, and much better that it ends in the short run than in the long run. But it depends on the will of the participants.
You make a point in the recent piece that the only quick, real route to peace would be for the Russian governing elite somehow to force Putin out of power. It did happen with Nikita Khrushchev in 1964 when the Russian elite got together and forced him out of office. Could it happen with President Putin as well?
It could. I mean, as I was talking to a Russian friend about this in Moscow just yesterday, and I did incidentally say, look, do you want to talk about this on an open line? And he said, oh, well, they listen to everything anyway. And he said, very, very difficult. Putin's isolated. He has incredible security and so on. But as he put it, things happen in Russia. There was a coup against Gorbachev. There was an attempted coup against Yeltsin. So it's not inconceivable. Partly also because, these strange films that Putin has been releasing of his dialogue with his inner core of people, that they don't seem that happy about what he was doing. He more or less humiliated the head of their foreign intelligence service, Narishkin, just ahead of the invasion, where he forced him to publicly endorse what Putin was doing yesterday. And when he put the nuclear forces on alert yesterday, I mean, maybe one's reading too much into body language, but the chief of the armed forces, Shoigu, did not exactly sort of beam with delight and salute as he was asked to do this. He just sort of nodded. So you've got to believe, particularly if we're right, that Putin, this is not the same man, that Putin has become much more reckless, much more isolated, that there are people in the Russian elite who do not like the way this is going. And also, incidentally, obviously a lot of wealth is being destroyed. People who were used to be able to fly to London, had houses all over the place, kids in schools in the West, that's all over. So there's a lot of anger there, I would imagine. But whether that can be coalesced into a coherent effort to force Putin from power is it would be extremely risky and very hard to organize, but perhaps it will happen.
What do you make of the protests that we're seeing inside Russia, especially in St. Petersburg? Are these just isolated people, as Moscow would have us believe, or do you sense that there is genuine disquiet? I know a lot of people from my course back at the Harvard Business School who are from Russia. I know they're very uncomfortable. They may not be voicing this publicly, but what's your reading of the political temperature inside Russia at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that they do reflect much wider opinion, because you've got to be very brave to go on those demonstrations. You get beaten up, you get arrested. This is not like sort of waving a placard and going home for a cup of tea. You're risking life and limb, liberty. So if a few thousand are prepared to take that risk, there must be many other thousands who think that, but for understandable reasons don't want to risk their necks for now. So and we also saw around the time when Navalny was, before he was arrested, there were demonstrations mainly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but actually in towns and cities right across Russia in support of Navalny, which is also, I think, a proxy for discontent with Putin. So, yeah, I think that there is probably quite deep-seated discontent with this. And it may go deeper than the normal kind of, if you like, liberal intelligentsia of the cities, who they have their equivalents probably in Delhi and London and New York, the kind of people who would demonstrate against Donald Trump or whatever. They have their Russian equivalents. They're not necessarily the whole country. But now you've got people being killed in this war, in a war that the Russians haven't even admitted to, really. They say it's still a kind of special military operation. And this is a largely conscript army. So, Russia's taking heavy casualties, and I'm not sure why should the Russian people think that's fine? I don't see why they would accept that.
President Trump gave an interview to Business Insider where he talks of a world war, while of course we're at a very early stage yet. Is that something that concerns you, Gideon?
Yeah, a bit. I mean, normally I would try to avoid talk that's like that, but obviously Russia is, one of the world's nuclear powers. It's cornered. And it is in confrontation with the West. And Putin is deliberately attempting to intimidate the West by making these threats of nuclear war. But there is always a danger of confrontation, particularly given that the Europeans and the Americans are flying arms into Ukraine. Let me say at this point, I don't think it will happen. I mean, I think the conflict will be contained. But you can see there are clearly risks. The one is that Putin takes a deliberate a decision to escalate, to confront the West. But the other is that, for example, let's say the Russian Air Force chases the Ukrainian Air Force into Polish airspace across the border, and the Polish Air Force comes up, scrambles, you get a clash between the Russian and Polish Air Forces. Then you have Russia actually in direct conflict with NATO powers. And then Article 5, the mutual security guarantee, comes into play. So I think there's the risk of deliberate confrontation, unless we're really radically misreading Putin's mind, or he's really gone crazy. I don't think that'll happen. Can't rule it out. But then there's also the risk of unintentional escalation.
Professor John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago makes an interesting point where he blames the West for Putin's anger, saying that the eastward expansion of NATO and trying to co-opt countries like Ukraine, which are part of the key strategic interests of Russia, is really what's irked Putin, and as a great power, he's doing what he must to defend his interests.
Yeah, I mean, Mearsheimer's been making that case for a long time. And, I guess he'll be feeling vindicated, because the argument was always that, this is an inherently unstable order, this will end in war. But, I actually don't think that any Russian leader would have done what Putin's done. This didn't have to end in war. If you have a slightly more kind of liberal approach to the world, there were ways of keeping Ukraine within the Russian cultural space without invading it. In fact, I think, this ultimately will end with an absolute guarantee that Ukraine will never be politically part of Russia again, because he's given the single biggest boost you could ever have to Ukrainian nationalism. I have friends, like you, Russian friends, who by no means, anti-Russian or pro-West, but who've argued for a long time, look, what you should do if you want to bring Ukraine back is to build business ties, build cultural ties. There is a long history, a common history. There's a common language. Most Ukrainians have relatives in Russia. It shouldn't be that hard to create, based on goodwill, a commonality between Russia and Ukraine. And I think that, one of the things that Mearsheimer misses is that a big threat, I think, to Putin was simply that Ukraine had become, albeit a democracy, a flawed democracy, no doubt about it. But, Zelensky is elected. There is free media in Ukraine and so on. And that's a sort of dangerous counterexample to Putin, particularly the way it happened. There was a pro-Russian president who was overthrown in a kind of popular uprising. And I think that was the kind of thing that Putin feared might happen in Moscow. So I don't think it's purely about geostrategic interests, protecting from NATO. NATO was never going to attack Russia. But I think that he did see Ukraine as a threat, but not in a sort of classically military sense, but more as an alternative vision of what Russia might be, which I don't think he wanted.
And finally, the US and Europe pushing for a vote at the UN General Assembly aimed at isolating Russia. What are you making of what the UN is attempting to do and reactions in different countries to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, the Russians must have been a bit discontented by what happened at the UN Security Council, where, literally nobody voted with them. China abstained. And in fact, I'd be interested to hear from you why India abstained. I mean, I think that was a bit more surprising from a Western point of view. But it wasn't a great show of support for Russia. And I think, these things are about creating moral and diplomatic pressure. I suspect there will be a big condemnation in the UN General Assembly as well. Wars of aggression are not fashionable for good reasons. So I think Russia will find itself very isolated. But I don't think that will be enough, unfortunately, to change Putin's mind, because his whole survival really now is at stake. He has to win this war from a personal point of view, let alone a national point of view.
For your insights and your time, Gideon Rachman, thank you very much for joining us on India Today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.